about FDA regulations, give an update on FDA regulations of e-cigarettes and vaping. We'll allow 5 minutes for questions at the end. And if you're having any difficulty in accessing or hearing or any technical problems, please type into the chat box, and we are monitoring this on this end, and we'll get back to you. And also, please feel free to submit questions in the chat box during the course of my talk, and I will get to as many as we can at the end. In terms of disclosures, I have no conflicts of interest. I do not receive tobacco industry funding. My funding is all through federal, state, and local sources. And I do sit as a member of the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Council, TPSAC, for the FDA. I'll give you an update on the FDA regulation status for electronic nicotine devices, ENDS, or e-cigarettes. Then we'll talk about, well, why is this important? Why should we care? And then give a summary. And then, as I said, we'll take some questions. This is the timeline of FDA regulation of e-cigarettes. And I'll march you through the timeline, and then we'll go through each one individually and talk about it in a little more detail. In June 2009, President Obama signed into law the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act. In May of 2016, FDA issued the final deeming rule, and just this past summer, July 2017, FDA adopted a new approach, and as I said, we'll go through each one. So in terms of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, this gave the FDA authority to regulate the manufacture, distribution, and marketing of tobacco products to protect the public health. This act gave the FDA immediate regulatory authority over certain tobacco products, cigarettes, cigarette tobacco, roll your own, smokeless tobacco. In addition, it gave the FDA the authority to issue regulations deeming other kinds of tobacco products to be subject to regulatory authority. So I want to talk a minute about what it means to regulate products to protect the public health. FDA is required to take a population health approach, a public health approach, in its regulatory strategies. And what does this mean? This means that the FDA looks at not just the product toxicity to the individuals who are using the tobacco products, as well as to the people who are being exposed to the tobacco products, but also looks at what it would be the impact of having this tobacco product on the market in terms of patterns of use. Will people be switching entirely to this product? How much will they be using? Will they be doing dual use? Will they be using this perhaps instead of quitting? Will they be using it in situations where they might not otherwise be able to smoke, so that it's not really changing their overall use patterns? How does it affect former users? Does it lead former users to relapse? How does it affect never users? Does it encourage never users to begin using tobacco products that they might not otherwise have done? So it's a public health, population health approach that the FDA is required to take. And on the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Council, we have that focus as well. We're given the direction to take that focus. As I said, the Tobacco Control Act also gave the FDA authority to issue regulations deeming other kinds of tobacco products to be subject to regulatory authority. In May of 2016, the FDA issued its final deeming rule. This rule took effect August 8th, 2016, and this extended the FDA's authority over other tobacco products, and these other tobacco products included e-cigarettes, cigars, hookah, and their components and parts, and also extends to the new generation of heat-not-burn products that are not yet approved for release in the United States. The regulations that had applied to the first round of tobacco products that were under FDA regulation applies now. This deeming rule extended them to the application to these newly regulated tobacco products, or the newly available tobacco products for regulation, which means no sale to minors, bans on vending machine sales except in adult-only facilities, bans on providing free samples, this prohibited unapproved modified risk claims. So some of you may remember some decades ago when the tobacco companies had the low tar, low nicotine products on the market, promoting them as health promoting or risk reducing. And in fact, this was a scam. This was not the case. This was demonstrated by the tobacco company's own documents. But from the public standpoint, it appeared that these were lower risk products, and this changed the smoking patterns of the population. So to avoid that kind of pathway from occurring, the FDA has identified a specific pathway for requesting approval to be able to make modified risk claims on tobacco products. There's a required submission to the FDA of disclosure of all ingredients and health documents associated with tobacco products. There's a required pre-market authorization of new tobacco products, and the FDA has a whole process set up on their website for how to do this. This newly defined vape shops that mix or assemble e-liquid or products to be treated as manufacturers and included under the regulations that apply to tobacco product manufacturers. And in fact, e-cigarettes are considered tobacco products under the FDA definition. And the FDA required that new products with a grandfather date of February 15th, 2007 be submitted and approved by August 8th, 2018 to go to market. So what's changed? This past summer, in July of 2017, the FDA adopted a new approach to the regulation of tobacco products. And on July 28th, FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb announced this new plan. And some of you may have seen the press releases and the press conferences that occurred around this plan. I'll go through that with you now. The premises of this new approach is that nicotine is delivered through products, and the tobacco products represent really a continuum of risk, with the highest risk products being the combustible tobacco products like cigarettes. Those are at the high end of the risk continuum. At the low end of the risk continuum are products like FDA-approved nicotine medications. And there may be other products that apply or that fall at various places along that continuum. The FDA also identified that although nicotine is highly addicting, and this is not inconsequential, and nicotine has physiologic effects and some adverse effects in and of itself, however, on whole, the FDA has stated that nicotine has been shown to be less harmful than other components of combustible tobacco products. So the approach being taken is that nicotine will be at the center of the regulatory efforts, with this new view of tobacco products as representing a continuum of risk. And the quote from Dr. Gottlieb: envisioning a world where cigarettes would no longer create or sustain addiction, and where adults who still need or want nicotine could get it from alternative and less harmful sources. So we'll move away from abstinence-only type approaches to looking at a continuum of risk and the potential for harm reduction. What does this mean? How does this translate into strategies? Well, the strategies are several-fold, and the ultimate goal is to decrease cigarettes' addictiveness and to reduce the toll of tobacco products on society. The first strategy is to explore reducing nicotine in cigarettes to non-addictive levels, concurrently not altering the nicotine in non-combustible products such as e-cigarettes. The FDA was given the authority by Congress to reduce nicotine in tobacco products, although it cannot eliminate nicotine in tobacco products. This gives them a bit of latitude. So the FDA is taking the approach, can we lower nicotine in cigarettes to a sufficiently low level that would be non-addictive, and targeting cigarettes as the combustible tobacco product that is at the highest end of the risk continuum. So can we make these products non-addictive by lowering nicotine to a sufficiently low level, concurrently not altering nicotine in other products that may be elsewhere along the risk continuum. And in this case, they are classifying e-cigarettes as products that are potentially elsewhere along that risk continuum below the level of combustible tobacco products. The FDA is exploring this. They are initiating a public dialogue about product standards for lowering nicotine levels, as stated here. They plan to issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to seek input on the potential health benefits and also the potential adverse effects of lowering nicotine in cigarettes. So they're really moving into this information gathering phase to look at what would be the impacts of doing taking this approach to nicotine regulation. And this is something that's been discussed on both sides of the issue in the scientific community for a number of years now, with the potential towards, is it feasible to take a harm reduction approach? Okay. If you go down to the third bullet, at the other end of the spectrum, the FDA is concurrently examining expanding the access and use of FDA-approved medicinal nicotine products for cessation, because these are at the lower end of the risk continuum. And we know that they're being underutilized, so the FDA is exploring what can be done to expand the access and use of these relatively safe products that are at the low end of the risk continuum, concurrently while driving people away from using combustible cigarettes by reducing nicotine to levels that are non-addicting, to levels that will not give users the amount of nicotine that they're seeking, which means they're likely to choose other products if they're available. The public hearing was scheduled in January for examining the expanding access and use of FDA-approved nicotine products. The comment period extends through February 15th, and I've listed the link here for you. You are on the front lines. You're seeing what's happening with nicotine medication use in your practices, and I encourage you to please weigh in on this issue by clicking on this link and submitting your response to the FDA, and these kinds of things will be taken into consideration as part of the FDA's deliberations on how to handle this. Okay, in between is encouraging innovation for modified risk tobacco products. So as tobacco users, or if tobacco users are driven away from combustible tobacco products like cigarettes because nicotine is at too low a level to be satisfying for them. People don't really smoke a product, they don't really use a product unless they're getting something psychoactive. The psychoactive component in cigarettes and in tobacco is nicotine, so if they can drive them away from using combustible at the high end to using something that is potentially less harmful, then the goal is, can we reduce risk at a population level? One of the ways to do that is to improve access to FDA-approved medications. The other way to do it the FDA is taking is to encourage innovation for modified risk tobacco products, and electronic nicotine delivery systems, or e-cigarettes, are in this category. So to encourage innovation for modified risk tobacco products, the FDA has extended the deadline that was previously 2018. That's been extended now to August of 2022. And the goal is to move smokers down the risk continuum while concurrently not encouraging use in children and youth. Remember, from that population standpoint, if you've gotten people who would not otherwise start using tobacco products to now uptake tobacco products because they're being perceived as safe, you may not have an overall population impact, and children and youth are a particularly vulnerable population. This change in FDA's position has caused a bit of a delay. You saw the delay in the extension of the deadline for submissions, a little bit of a delay in setting up a regulatory structure to be able to evaluate non-combustibles within this new framework. During this interim, the regulations that were applied originally to the first round of regulated tobacco products still apply to e-cigarettes, the bans on selling to under 18, and so forth. What resources does the FDA currently have in place? They have a flyer available on their website for download and printing, available for retail establishments that identify the requirements for retail establishments, the no selling to under 18 and so forth. And this is the link. They've provided an infographic on avoiding explosions based on reports from the field and documented cases of people dying or being hospitalized and having even some hospitalization injuries caused by exploding tobacco products. E-cigarettes do explode, and so they've created an infographic that is available for download on ways to avoid explosions of e-cigarette devices. They've created a portal for reporting problems with e-cigarettes and any tobacco product, and they have a list of adverse events reports. And I urge you, if you have time, to click on this link. In fact, while you're watching, you may want to click on the link and just save it to view later, where you can look at what kinds of adverse events have been reported. On their plan list is to develop product standards to protect against e-cigarette battery issues, not enough to warn people what to do to avoid explosions, but rather to develop product standards to protect against e-cigarette battery issues so that these won't occur. To develop product standards around children's exposure to liquid nicotine, and this will be done in consultation with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which was given the authority in 2016 to provide product standards to have require child-safe containers for liquid nicotine. The liquid nicotine that's used in e-cigarettes is often can be at the sufficient level to cause health risks and even death. They also plan to issue advance notices of proposed rulemaking to address the flavorings in tobacco products that are particularly appealing to children and youth. So why is this important? E-cigarettes have been evolving or mutating, depending on your perspective, over the years through multiple generations of e-cigarette products, beginning with the cig-alikes up through tank systems and products that provide the ability to modify the voltage, to modify the temperature, to modify the amount of nicotine and the amount of vapor that is coming through, along with the other constituents in e-cigarette products. There are electronic versions of other combustible products, pipes, hookah, cigars, and the e-cigarettes have gone through at least 4 generations now of product types, with the increase over time and the ability for the users to really control the flow of constituents and the flow of vapor that they're inhaling and exhaling into the environment. The latest addition to this group would be Juuls, and I'm curious, maybe if you've had experience with your patients who are using Juuls, please share that with the group in the chat box. This is an electronic nicotine delivery device that is very high-tech, that looks like a flash drive. And it's become very popular among youth because it's something they can hold in the palm of their hands while they're in school, while they're in situation without anyone knowing that they actually have an e-cigarette, and they can slip a vape from time to time. There are, if you look at some of the social media posts giving instructions on how you can vape, and if someone sees you, you can blow the smoke down into your shirt, and meanwhile you can conceal the Juul in your hand while you're using it. So something that has high appeal to a population that is interested in techie looking devices and wants to do something surreptitiously, wants to have their nicotine dosing surreptitiously, and something that looks like things that they're already using. And here's one of the problems. There are over 400 brands of e-cigarettes on the market. There are over 7,000 flavors, and none is currently regulated. As a public health person, this worries me a great deal. And this is an $8 billion industry and growing, so there's a tremendous push to perpetuate this industry. And so we in the public health community and the FDA as well are really in a position of having to objectively evaluate what do we know scientifically about this product and how these products and how might regulations impact on the public health. There has been a perception in the community that because what you're inhaling is vapor, it's just the nicotine is vaporized, is heated and vaporized, generally in vegetable glycerin or propylene glycol. There may be flavorings added to it, and this is then inhaled by the user. And the perception has been, well, it's really just water vapor. How bad can this be? This has got to be, this can't be harmful. This isn't really hurting me. So the question is it just water vapor? What do we know about this? The FDA funded the National Academies of Sciences to convene an expert panel to review what is known about the harmful effects of e-cigarettes, and the FDA will use this as part of their deliberations. I'll present to you some of the summaries of the report, as well as some additional studies that have occurred since the time of the report, since the time of the review by the expert committee. The report was released just this past month, and again, some of you may have seen the press on this. If not, you can find it online from the National Academies of Sciences report, 2018 report on e-cigarettes. I have the reference for you at the end of this talk. And so let's go through. On the positive side, the 2018 National Academies of Sciences report committee indicated that the predominance of the data indicate that e-cigarettes reduce exposure to many of the toxicants present in combustible tobacco products. This isn't surprising since they're not combusted. You wouldn't expect to find the same kinds of, or the same kinds or levels of toxicants that you find in combustible tobacco products in something that's not combusted. They also found that again, based on a large view of the literature, that switching completely to e-cigarettes appears to reduce some of the short-term adverse health effects of combustible tobacco products, and they found moderate evidence that e-cigarettes reduce secondhand vapor exposure to nicotine and to particulates that are present in combustible tobacco products. On the negative side, and I just want to give a disclosure here, or a caveat here, that it looks like I've put a lot more on the right side here. This is not necessarily a reflection of the balance reflected in the National Academies of Sciences report, but because we need to look at what are the potential risks to our patients and to society, to the public health. These are the kinds of things that we're concerned about. So I've given a bit more detail on the right side, because these are the kinds of things that would, as I said, that would be of concern. Okay, the products were found to contain and emit many potentially toxic substances. The aerosol contains metals, in some cases more metals than would be found in cigarettes and combustible tobacco products. Part of this is due to the product characteristics, the metals that are used, for example, in the solders in e-cigarettes that can produce little bits of metal that will break off and be inhaled. Dr. Irfan Rahman and colleagues here at the University of Rochester in his lab have demonstrated that the e-cigarettes that they tested contain 6 times more copper relative to combustible tobacco products. E-cigarettes can induce endothelial cell dysfunction, excuse me, oxidative stress. Generally, these are less than in combustible tobacco products, although not always. And again, these are associated with higher levels of inflammation that have also been demonstrated relative to no use. In some cases, less than in e-cigarettes. In some cases, equivalent to in some cases, less than combustible tobacco products. In some cases, equivalent. In some cases, perhaps more. There are a number of chemicals, a number of toxicants in e-cigarettes and e-cigarette vapor that can cause DNA damage, mutagenesis, that have the potential for causing cancer. They haven't been in use long enough to see does cancer actually develop, but they have the potential to cause cancer. And we see some of the aldehydes like formaldehyde, acrolein, acetaldehyde. We see increases in airborne concentration of particulate matter, especially PM2.5, fine and ultrafine particles, and nicotine versus background environments where there is no e-cigarette vapor. In some cases, the amount of particulate matter, particularly PM2.5, is even higher than would be produced by cigarettes. And this has considerable health concerns or potential health concerns. Nicotine levels, particularly in the newer products where there's more control about what comes through, can equal that of combustible tobacco products. And e-cigarettes increase the risk of using combustibles. That has been shown in multiple large-scale projects that students, youth who start using e-cigarettes are more likely to go on to use combustible tobacco products, and they're more likely to use them more intensely. There's limited evidence, it's very limited evidence that e-cigarettes enhance the ability of tobacco users to quit, and there's no evidence that they're more effective than FDA-approved products that you know about and that you'll be hearing more about today. Some explode, as we said. Nicotine affects adolescent brain development adversely in terms of interfering with concentration and other cognitive function in addition to causing addiction. And the effects on health, the actual effects of e-cigarettes on health, are unknown. A couple of examples, when we talk about lowering some of the short-term adverse health effects, there's some at least short-term evidence that use of e-cigarettes may decrease some respiratory symptoms, symptoms in asthma, in asthmatics, may decrease blood pressure. Studies have gone both ways on this, and may decrease COPD exacerbation, though some short-term effects also show increase in respiratory distress. In terms of endothelial cell dysfunction, there's evidence that e-cigarettes and the toxicants in e-cigarettes can cause DNA damage to cell lines in human embryonic cells. There's an increase in gingival inflammation that was found in one study 2 weeks after switching. There's evidence that in terms of gene expression, that e-cigarettes and cigarettes are equivalent in their effect on suppressing gene expression in nasal epithelial cells. E-cigarettes are actually more damaging than cigarettes in the number of gene expression changes and in producing stronger levels of gene suppression. So what do we look at? On one side, it looks like there's some areas where there's decreased exposure, there may be decreased risk. On the other side, it looks like there's some areas of great concern in terms of potential adverse effects of e-cigarettes. And these are the kinds of issues that we need to grapple with. One is there a dose relation between reduced exposure and risk? So, for example, if risk can occur at even very low levels of exposure, then if you have the exposure, you haven't necessarily have the risk. There may be a threshold above which, if you've reached this threshold, you're going to have the risk, and there's not that dose relation between reduced exposure and risk. What is the exposure with actual use? The way subjects use e-cigarettes in laboratories in a 1 to 2 week switching period may be very different from the way they use it in the real world, and that may influence the dose and what's coming through. What is the impact of studies that some find reduced exposure, some find equivalent exposure, some find increased exposure? What is the net effect? Even if there is lower exposure, what's the impact of exposure to this lower exposure over prolonged periods of time? Are there unique risks of e-cigarettes that have not been identified yet because we're comparing them to what might be in combustible tobacco products? Which e-cigarettes are we looking at? E-cigarettes have evolved over time so that studies with older e-cigarettes may not be applicable to the newer generations of e-cigarettes. What are the unique effects of flavorings? And there's a large and growing, or a small but growing literature that flavorings in and of themselves may have some adverse effects, including those, again, by Dr. Irfan Rahman and his group here at the University of Rochester. What is the impact on health? The direct impact on health, the effects of secondhand vapor, the effects of thirdhand vapor, how much harm reduction is enough, because reduced harm is not the same as safe, and harm reduction for whom? How does this affect vulnerable populations? And ultimately, the FDA needs to come to some conclusion on what is the population or what is the overall public health impact. So to summarize, this is a highly controversial area. There are people on both sides of the argument who will read the science and say, everyone should switch to e-cigarettes. On the other side say, we're very concerned about some of what we're seeing here. So great controversy in this field. They do appear to have fewer toxicants relative to combustibles, although this is not universal. And the question is, how low is low enough, and what does this mean? Because the effects on health outcomes are undetermined. There are special concerns that I've listed here, and there's limited evidence for potential cessation benefits, no evidence that they have an improved effect over FDA-approved medication, and FDA is extending the regulation period as they shift to this focus on the risk continuum. So what works? You'll be hearing about this today. There are interventions that are evidence-based, minimum of a brief intervention with follow-up, referral to quitline or other intensive programs that are evidence-based, and the use of FDA-approved medications. For patients who use e-cigarettes, we certainly don't want them to return to combustibles. We'd like them to stop everything because the evidence base is clear for complete cessation of all tobacco products. And there are alternatives available, including the FDA-approved nicotine inhaler, and use of at least some of the FDA-approved medications over prolonged periods of time have been demonstrated to be safe. And I'll end with some resources for you and your patients. The infographic on avoiding explosions. This is your link. This would be a good thing to download and to have available for you to hand out to your patients who are using e-cigarettes while you're working with them. Please do use that FDA portal for reporting any problems with e-cigarettes or any tobacco product. And again, here's the list of adverse events for you to view, because this will give you some idea of what has been seen by others around the country. And at this point, I'll stop and we'll take some questions.
And at this point, we have no questions in chat.
Oh, okay. At this point, we're hearing we have no questions in chat. So I will show you a couple of additional slides. But in the meantime, if you do have questions, please enter your questions. And if you're having some problem accessing the chat, do we have an alternate for people if they're unable to access the chat?
They can go to the URL that was previously shown for the program survey and put data in there.
Okay.
And we'll get back to them.
Okay, there was a URL for the program survey that was provided to you previously. Feel free to put your questions there and we will get back to you.
As long as they provide a means.
As long as you provide a means for us to get back to you. So make sure to list your email address. These are the references that I've listed. These are a selection of specific studies, although more studies were drawn from the National Academy of Sciences report. I particularly draw your attention to the Qasim study, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing this name, in the Journal of the American Heart Association. This is an excellent review. This came out just last year, so it really provides an excellent review of the impact or the potential impact of e-cigarettes on the cardiovascular system, but also provides an excellent overview of what are some of the potential risks or areas where they look to be of sufficient concern that require additional attention and additional research. And with appreciation to my colleague, Dr. Dan Croft, who supplied these slides or let me use these slides that he uses as part of his standard presentation. When we talk about liquid nicotine poisoning, this is a real concern that we have, and this is why child-safe products are needed and in fact are approved now for presentation. And this is an example of an 18-month-old who ingested nicotine liquid from an e-cigarette and suffered a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. We find kids who maybe a little nicotine is spilled on the carpet during use, even with child-safe containers, and they're crawling around on the carpet and they're absorbing it and they're becoming sick from it. So we really need to have very good product control. Similarly with flavorings, the fact that there are flavorings that are candy, that are fruit flavored, that are in flavors that appeal to kids, and they look like they're candy, and they look like something to ingest and be appealing to even the youngest of children and can pose risks to them, and very serious risks. And in terms of e-cigarette batteries having the potential to explode, again, with appreciation to Dr. Croft for sharing this slide, this is a case of an e-cigarette user who suffered paralysis, facial fractures, and burns to his mouth and shattered teeth from an e-cigarette device that he was using that exploded. And months later, he's just starting to be able to walk now. A man in Scotland died. He was on oxygen and was using an e-cigarette, and it exploded. And you may be aware that e-cigarettes are not allowed in checked luggage because of the potential for explosion, although they can be carried on the flight.
Still no questions.
Okay, still we have no questions. Do we have a possibility for follow-up questions? I believe through the URL.
Yes.
So please, after the talk, if you have questions that you would like to share, please do send them to us, and make sure to include an email so that we can get back to you with contact. And we look forward to hearing from you. And we look forward to hearing not only your questions, but also your experiences with e-cigarettes. And I ask you that because it helps us as the Center for Tobacco-Free Finger Lakes to really hear from you what kinds of concerns or what kinds of, are there benefits that you are seeing that perhaps or potential benefits that we haven't mentioned here, or potential risks and potential concerns, potential ways that your patients may be using e-cigarettes, because we know that even use patterns are evolving that we may not be aware of. And I ask you that in my role with the Center for Tobacco-Free Finger Lakes, my role as director of the Smoking Research Program here at the University of Rochester, and I certainly am a member of TPSAC at the FDA, and that's something that we as a group are evaluating. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to hearing from you.